In 1889, a single arrest warrant threatened to collapse the British throne. The target was Lord Arthur Somerset, the center of the Cleveland Street gay scandal, a secret male prostitution ring directly linked to the royal succession. But instead of executing justice, the royal family intervened and covered up the entire investigation. This is the record of how one disgraced aristocrat weaponized a secret to hold the most powerful legal system on earth hostage. The Victorian establishment is heavily romanticized as an era of ironclad morality, stiff upper lips, and unyielding decency, a time when society operated on a strict code of honor and public virtue. Outwardly, a man like Lord Arthur Somerset, the closest confidant to Prince Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, would be the ultimate embodiment of this rigid aristocratic ideal. Born in 1851 as the son of the 8th Duke of Beaufort, Somerset entered a world where privilege was not merely a circumstance but an absolute birthright. The Beaufort family was one of the most powerful and ancient houses in the realm, their lineage woven deeply into the fabric of British history. Growing up in the sprawling estates of Gloucestershire, Arthur, known affectionately to his inner circle as Podge, was groomed for a life of quiet power and visible obedience to the crown. He was a man defined by the uniforms he wore and the titles he held, standing proudly beside the Prince of Wales in full royal regalia during the most sacred ceremonies of the British Empire. Yet this public image was a meticulously constructed facade, a heavy armor worn to survive the suffocating expectations of his class. Beneath the military medals and royal appointments lay a fragile human reality. As superintendent of the royal stables, he controlled them from an incredibly prestigious position that placed him in daily, intimate contact with the heir to the throne. He was wealthy, deeply respected, and visibly present at every major state function. He represented the absolute peak of British high society, a living symbol of stability and tradition. The royal family and the government under Prime Minister Lord Salisbury desperately needed men like Somerset to project an undisputed image of moral superiority to the rest of the world. They relied on this illusion to maintain the absolute, unquestioned honor of the monarchy. However, Somerset carried a profound personal burden. He lived with desires that his society not only condemned, but fiercely criminalized. The contradictions of his life were staggering. By day, he was the enforcer of royal dignity. By night, he sought connection and release in a hidden world that could destroy him in an instant. Somerset wanted to indulge in a lifestyle true to his nature while maintaining his flawless public standing, an impossible balancing act in a society that operated on brutal double standards. He was a man trapped in a paradox, experiencing the profound isolation that comes from knowing that the very people who bow to you in the daylight would lock you in a cage if they knew where you walked at night. These two desires were entirely incompatible, and the friction between them was quietly building toward a political inferno. The geography of this secret life was starkly divided. Late 19th century London was a city of extreme contrasts, where unimaginable wealth lived mere streets away from crushing, desperate poverty. While Somerset occupied the glittering palaces of the West End, the spark that would eventually ignite his downfall was struck in the sprawling, smog-choked streets of Fitzrovia. There, at 19 Cleveland Street, a man named Charles Hammond operated a discreet establishment. Outwardly, It was just another unremarkable house in a working-class neighborhood. Inside, however, it was a hidden sanctuary and a male brothel catering exclusively to wealthy, aristocratic gentlemen. Hammond provided a space where the elite could shed their titles and their public morality, paying for absolute discretion and the company of young men. The human reality of Cleveland Street was a harsh intersection of absolute power and desperate survival. Many of the young men Hammond employed were telegraph messengers for the General Post Office. These were working-class boys, often barely in their late teens, navigating a brutal economic system that offered them very little hope of advancement. For a few shillings, a sum that meant the difference between starvation and survival, they were drawn into a dangerous transactional world. It was a cold economy of silence and pleasure. Somerset was one of Hammond's most prominent and loyal patrons. He spent vast sums of money maintaining this double life, moving seamlessly from the manicured lawns of royal estates to the shadowy, fog-drenched corridors of Fitzrovia. It was a perilous game, played with the constant, underlying anxiety of discovery. The personal suffering involved in hiding one's core identity, combined with the exploitation inherent in the class divide, created a volatile atmosphere just waiting for a single mistake. That fatal error occurred in the summer of 1889, not through a grand betrayal, but through a simple bureaucratic anomaly. The British state, for all its grand imperial focus, was incredibly efficient at monitoring the lower classes. In July, a routine investigation by the Post Office's Confidential Inquiry Branch flagged something unusual. A 15-year-old telegraph messenger named Charles Thomas Swinskow possessed far more money than his meager weekly wages could possibly explain. In the grinding poverty of Victorian London, unexplained wealth in the hands of a working-class boy was an immediate red flag. The post office investigators brought Swinskow in for questioning. Under the crushing weight of institutional interrogation, terrified of losing his job and facing prison, the boy broke. He confessed to his secondary source of income, revealing the existence of the house at 19 Cleveland Street and the nature of the services provided there. The case was immediately handed over to the Metropolitan Police, and the narrative shifted from a minor postal theft inquiry to a major criminal investigation. The police moved with swift, decisive force. They raided the Cleveland Street address, shattering the fragile sanctuary Hammond had built. Several individuals were arrested, and the panicked suspects were dragged into the cold, unforgiving light of Scotland Yard interrogation rooms. It was here, in the desperate scramble for self-preservation, that the dam finally broke. An 18-year-old post office clerk named Henry Newlove realized he was facing severe penal servitude. Trying to save himself, he offered the police the only currency he had left: information. He began to list the names of Hammond's high-profile clients, men who had promised wealth and protection, but were nowhere to be found when the police arrived. Among the names spoken in that grim, echoing room was Lord Arthur Somerset. The impact of that name on the investigating officers was immediate and paralyzing. The police were suddenly aware that they had inadvertently stumbled into a socio-political minefield capable of fracturing the monarchy. The public was still blissfully unaware, continuing to view Somerset as a pillar of the community and a trusted servant of the crown. But within the closed doors of Scotland Yard and the Home Office, Panic began to spread like a virus. The investigators, men accustomed to dealing with street-level crime, realized that this scandal had the potential to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction that could shake the very foundations of the British government. The social chasm between a telegraph boy and a royal equerry was immense. The fact that they were intimately connected in a highly illegal, highly stigmatized enterprise was a reality the Victorian public could not and would not peacefully absorb. From the very second Newlove uttered his name, Lord Arthur Somerset ceased to be a respected nobleman in the eyes of the law. He instantly transformed into a walking, talking existential threat to the British establishment. If Somerset was exposed, investigated, and put on trial, the inquiry would inevitably ask who else he brought to Cleveland Street. Who else in the Prince of Wales's inner circle was involved? The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the government was about to realize that the rules of justice they applied so ruthlessly to the poor were about to be tested against a man who possessed the power to bring the monarchy to its knees. The immediate aftermath of Henry Newlove's confession inside Scotland Yard was not marked by the triumphant energy of a cracked case, but by a profound, suffocating silence. The investigating officers stared at the transcript, fully understanding that the name written there had transformed their routine vice raid into a political explosive. Leading this quiet terror was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man whose name would forever be etched in history for his relentless, albeit unsuccessful pursuit of Jack the Ripper in the blood-soaked alleys of Whitechapel just a year prior. Aberline was the antithesis of Lord Arthur Somerset. He was a pragmatic, fiercely intelligent working-class policeman who had clawed his way up through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police. He possessed an intimate understanding of the darkest, most desperate corners of human nature, and crucially, he harbored absolutely no romantic illusions about the inherent virtue of the aristocracy. To Aberline, a crime was a crime, whether committed in a filthy tenement or a Mayfair townhouse. Yet even Aberline knew the unspoken rules of the empire he served. He recognized that prosecuting the equerry to the Prince of Wales would require more than just the word of a terrified teenage telegraph messenger. The British establishment did not fear crime, they feared exposure. They operated on a delicate machinery of reputation and public perception, and a scandal of this magnitude would shatter the carefully curated image of Victorian moral supremacy. As Aberline gathered his detectives, the air in the room was heavy with the realization that they were no longer simply hunting criminals. They were quietly declaring war on the inner sanctum of the monarchy. While the police meticulously built their case, verifying dates, tracking financial transactions, and securing further corroborating statements from other terrified boys, Lord Arthur Somerset continued his existence in the blinding light of the public eye. This period, the tense, agonizing weeks of late summer in 1889, highlights the absolute fragility of his human experience. Somerset was a man walking a tightrope over an abyss, forced to maintain an unyielding facade of aristocratic perfection, while his internal world collapsed in slow motion. He attended grand state dinners, he inspected the immaculate royal cavalry, and he stood faithfully at the right hand of Prince Albert Edward, laughing at the future king's jokes. Every smile was a calculated performance. Every public appearance was an exercise in pure psychological endurance. The weight of that contradiction was terrifying. He was surrounded by the most powerful figures in the British Empire, men who could summon armies and rewrite laws. Yet he knew that a single file sitting on a wooden desk in Scotland Yard held the power to strip him of his humanity, his wealth, and his freedom. He watched the newspapers, searching the columns for any hint of a leak. He observed the faces of the politicians and courtiers around him, wondering if the whispers had already begun. The golden cage of his privilege was shrinking, its bars closing in with every passing hour. This was the personal suffering of a man who realized that the system he had devoted his life to defending was entirely ruthless, and it was about to consume him to preserve its own sanctity. In early August, the inevitable collision occurred. The authorities could no longer ignore the mounting pile of evidence, and Somerset was summoned for a formal interview. This meeting was not held in the grim gas-lit interrogation rooms of the lower classes, but in a setting deemed appropriate for a man of his station. Yet the polite surroundings could not mask the brutal reality of the confrontation. Somerset faced his interrogators armed with the only defense his class had ever needed: absolute, arrogant denial. He retreated behind the impenetrable shield of his title, his family name, and his proximity to the throne. He dismissed the testimonies of the telegraph boys as the malicious, desperate lies of common criminals attempting to extort a nobleman. It was a performance rooted in centuries of entrenched power, a demonstration of the profound belief that a lord's word was inherently worth more than a laborer's life. But Aberline and his superiors had built a cage of undeniable facts. They presented Somerset with dates, times, and specific details that only a patron of 19 Cleveland Street could possibly know. They watched as the polished veneer of the master of the horse began to crack. Somerset was intelligent enough to see the trajectory of the investigation. He realized that the conventional defenses, bribery, intimidation, and aristocratic bluster, would not hold against a police force that was now too deeply involved to quietly back away. The other high-profile clients of Hammond's brothel were beginning to panic. Some were fleeing the country. Others were desperately trying to secure the silence of the boys through their solicitors. Somerset recognized that he was being isolated, positioned by the universe to become the ultimate scapegoat for the sins of his peers. It was in this moment of profound desperation, staring down the barrel of social annihilation and a brutal prison sentence, that Lord Arthur Somerset made a decision that would alter the course of British history. He realized that if he could not rely on his privilege to save him, he would have to weaponize it. He understood the fundamental cowardice of the establishment he served. They did not care about justice. They cared about survival. If he went down alone, they would mourn him briefly and then erase him from their memories. But if he tied his own fate to the survival of the crown, they would have no choice but to protect him. During the highly sensitive back-channel communications with the authorities, as the pressure reached its absolute zenith, Somerset did not confess, nor did he beg for mercy. Instead, it is widely believed by historians that his legal team, led by solicitor Arthur Newton, delivered a cold, calculated message to the government. They deliberately dropped a set of initials into the negotiations: PAV, Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, the grandson of Queen Victoria, the man who was second in line to the British throne. Somerset insinuated with cold, calculated precision that Prince Eddie, as the young royal was known to his family, was not merely an acquaintance, but a frequent and enthusiastic visitor to the hidden rooms of 19 Cleveland Street. Somerset made his terms brutally clear. If the Metropolitan Police proceeded with their warrants, if he was dragged into the dock at the Old Bailey to face a public trial, he would not go quietly. He would ensure that the future King of England was subpoenaed. He would drag the heir to the throne into the courtroom, forcing the most powerful empire on the globe to confront the sexual realities of its ruling family in the daily newspapers. The impact of this threat was immediate and paralyzing. It was an act of pure, unadulterated blackmail against the state. Somerset had taken the loaded gun of his own disgrace and pressed it directly against the temple of the British monarchy. By dropping those three initials, he transformed the narrative instantaneously. It was no longer a criminal investigation into a male brothel. It was a desperate, high-stakes hostage negotiation. The Metropolitan Police suddenly found themselves completely sidelined, their evidence rendered entirely irrelevant. The problem had escalated far beyond the jurisdiction of Scotland Yard. It had reached the ornate desks of the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, and inevitably the Prince of Wales himself. The machinery of justice abruptly stopped, replaced by the panicked, feverish mechanisms of supreme damage control. When the initials PAV were spoken, the immediate reaction within the highest echelons of the British government was not righteous indignation, but absolute freezing terror. The investigation, which had been accelerating with the terrifying momentum of a runaway train, hit an impenetrable wall of political self-preservation. Prime Minister Robert Gascoigne Cecil, Lord Salisbury, a man who governed the sprawling British Empire with iron-willed conservatism, was suddenly faced with a crisis that fleets and armies could not solve. The Prime Minister understood instantly that this was no longer a matter of criminal justice. It was an existential threat to the moral authority of the Crown. If the public, already simmering with class resentment and radical political thought, learned that the heir to the throne was potentially involved in a criminalized homosexual brothel, the resulting shockwave could permanently fracture the institution of the monarchy. The immediate casualty of this revelation was the integrity of the Metropolitan Police. Commissioner James Monroe and Inspector Frederick Aberline found their authority entirely castrated by the Home Office. The detectives had compiled a watertight dossier, corroborated by multiple witnesses, financial records, and physical evidence. They possessed more than enough legal justification to arrest Lord Arthur Somerset and place him in a holding cell. Yet every time Monroe requested the necessary warrants from the magistrates, he was met with unprecedented bureaucratic obstruction. The Lord Chancellor, Lord Halsbury, the highest legal authority in the land, personally intervened, wrapping the investigation in a suffocating layer of legal red tape. He demanded further evidence, questioned the reliability of the telegraph boys, and effectively blocked the police from executing their sworn duty. This orchestrated delay created one of the most grotesque displays of elite privilege in Victorian history. While the young men swept up in the Fitzrovia raid, boys who had sold their bodies out of sheer economic desperation were locked in freezing damp cells, awaiting trials that would ultimately sentence them to years of hard labor, Lord Arthur Somerset was simply granted a leave of absence. Instead of facing a judge, the superintendent of the royal stables packed his exquisite leather trunks and departed for Bad Homburg, a luxurious spa town in Germany. He spent the late summer weeks strolling through manicured gardens, taking the waters, and dining with European aristocracy, entirely insulated from the brutal machinery of the law that was currently crushing his former associates in London. It was a staggering demonstration of the dual nature of British justice, swift and merciless for the impoverished, yet endlessly accommodating and deferential to the aristocracy. However, the British establishment was not monolithic, and the cover-up was not seamless. Commissioner Monroe was a man of rigid principles, and the blatant obstruction of his officers enraged him. He recognized that the government was actively conspiring to pervert the course of justice, and he threatened to resign, a move that would undoubtedly leak the entire scandal to the radical press. The tension within the government reached a boiling point. Lord Salisbury was caught in an impossible crossfire. He had to protect the Prince of Wales and his son from absolute ruin, but he could not afford a mutiny within Scotland Yard. The whispers were already beginning to circulate through the elite gentlemen's clubs of St. James's. The longer Somerset remained entirely immune to prosecution, the louder the murmurs grew, threatening to spill over into the public domain. The crisis deepened when Somerset, demonstrating a spectacular mix of arrogance and detachment from reality, decided to return to England in the early autumn of 1889. He believed, perhaps genuinely, that the storm had passed, that his royal connections had successfully vaporized the investigation, and that he could seamlessly resume his life among the elite. He wished to attend the autumn hunting season, prioritizing his social calendar over his precarious legal survival. His return to London was the catalyst that forced the government's hand. Monroe and Abberline, seeing their suspect back on British soil, demanded immediate action. They presented Salisbury and the Home Secretary with an ultimatum. Either the warrants were issued or the police would no longer guarantee their silence. Salisbury realized that the dam was breaking. He could no longer legally protect Somerset without triggering a catastrophic institutional collapse. The warrants were finally authorized in mid-October, but the system that was designed to protect the crown had one final desperate maneuver to execute. The objective was no longer to prove Somerset's innocence. That was impossible. But to ensure he never took the stand. A trial meant cross-examination, and cross-examination meant the name of Prince Albert Victor would be entered into the public record. Therefore, Somerset had to disappear. Hours before Inspector Abberline was due to execute the arrest warrant, a quiet, urgent message was delivered to Somerset's residence. The exact identity of the messenger remains one of the great engineered mysteries of the Victorian era, though historians strongly suspect it was Sir Dighton Probyn, the fiercely loyal comptroller to the Prince of Wales, acting with the implicit blessing of the Prime Minister. The message was simple and brutal. The police were coming, the shield had been lowered, and he had to run. The facade of the invincible aristocrat shattered completely. In the dead of night, stripped of his dignity and his future, Lord Arthur Somerset fled his home. There was no time to pack his grand trunks or arrange his affairs. He rushed to the railway station, a desperate fugitive blending into the shadows, boarding the boat train to Dover. As the train tore through the darkened English countryside, Somerset was forced to reckon with the total annihilation of his identity. He crossed the English Channel just as the dawn was breaking, leaving behind his titles, his regiment, and his country forever. When Inspector Aberline finally arrived at Somerset's London address with the hard-won warrant in his hand, he was met only with an empty house and the bitter, undeniable realization that he had been outmaneuvered not by a criminal mastermind, but by the very government he served. The law had not failed. It had been explicitly instructed to look the other way. The morning sun that rose over London following Lord Arthur Somerset's midnight escape illuminated a city operating under two entirely different sets of laws. Inside the empty rooms of Somerset's residence, Inspector Frederick Aberline stood with a useless piece of paper in his hand. The arrest warrant fought for with such bitter determination against the highest legal authorities in the land was now nothing more than a historical artifact of a failed justice system. Aberline was not a naive man. He had walked the blood-stained pavements of Whitechapel and had seen the worst of human depravity, but the sheer orchestrated cynicism of this moment was a different kind of darkness. He understood immediately that he had not been beaten by a clever fugitive. He had been outmaneuvered by his own superiors. The state had effectively mobilized its resources to facilitate the escape of a wanted criminal. The police force, designed to protect the public, had been sidelined to protect the prestige of the crown. The immediate aftermath reveals the brutal mechanics of how power insulates itself. While Somerset was securing comfortable lodgings in the south of France, breathing the free air of the continent, the crushing weight of the British legal system fell squarely onto the shoulders of the poorest individuals involved in the Cleveland Street network. The government, having successfully removed the primary threat to the monarchy, now needed to demonstrate to the public that it was still fiercely committed to moral order. They required a spectacle of justice to mask the profound injustice that had just occurred. The young telegraph messengers, boys like Luke Kemp and Henry Newlove, were dragged into the dock at the Old Bailey. The contrast in their treatment is the defining tragedy of this entire narrative. These young men had no aristocratic titles to shield them, no vast family wealth to hire the best legal minds, and certainly no secret messages from the Prime Minister warning them to flee. They were the expendable collateral damage of a system that demanded a sacrifice. In the courtroom, they faced a hostile judge and a jury composed of middle-class men terrified of moral decay. The boys were prosecuted under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically the notorious Labouchere Amendment, which criminalized all homosexual acts between men, even in private. It was a blunt legal instrument used with devastating efficiency against the vulnerable. There was no leniency for their youth, nor any acknowledgement of the crushing economic desperation that had driven them to the doors of 19 Cleveland Street in the first place. The court did not care that these boys were essentially exploited by wealthy, powerful, older men. The sentences were swift and merciless. They were condemned to months of hard labor, a Victorian punishment designed to break the human spirit. Imagine the physical and psychological reality of their punishment locked in freezing, damp cells, forced to perform exhausting, meaningless tasks like walking the treadmill or picking oakum until their fingers bled. All while the man who had paid for their company was dining comfortably in a French chateau. This was not justice. It was a brutal reinforcement of the class system. The state was effectively punishing the victims to protect the perpetrators. The establishment needed to punish anyone who had threatened the delicate equilibrium of their cover-up. Arthur Newton was Lord Arthur Somerset's solicitor, a sharp, fiercely loyal lawyer who understood exactly how the Victorian legal game was played. When the scandal first broke and his client was threatened, Newton did what any high-priced defense attorney of the era would do. He tried to make the evidence disappear. Recognizing that the telegraph boys were the sole witnesses who could destroy Somerset, Newton engaged in a desperate, illegal campaign to silence them. He offered the boys substantial sums of money provided by his wealthy client and attempted to arrange passage for them to America or Australia. He wanted to put oceans between the witnesses and the Old Bailey. However, Newton made a fatal miscalculation. He believed that because he was acting on behalf of a powerful aristocrat, the state would turn a blind eye to his obstruction of justice. He failed to realize that once Somerset had fled, the government no longer needed to protect his lawyer. In fact, Newton became the perfect mid-level scapegoat. He was a professional, a man of some standing, but he lacked the royal connections that made Somerset untouchable. The police, furious over Somerset's escape and desperate to salvage some credibility, turned their sights on the solicitor. Newton was arrested, charged with conspiracy to defeat the ends of justice, and brought to trial. The trial of Arthur Newton was a masterclass in judicial hypocrisy. The prosecution, representing the very same government that had just facilitated Somerset's flight across the Channel, argued passionately about the absolute sanctity of the law and the profound evil of witness tampering. The judge delivered a stern lecture on legal ethics. Newton, abandoned by the aristocratic client he had ruined his career to protect, was convicted and sentenced to 6 weeks in prison. The establishment had successfully sent a message. You may break the law to protect the elite, but if you get caught, the elite will not protect you. Newton served his time, his professional reputation in tatters, a casualty of a war he thought he was winning. Yet despite the imprisonment of the boys and the solicitor, the silence surrounding the true nature of the scandal was beginning to fracture. The government had successfully muzzled the mainstream press. Respectable newspapers like the Times and the Morning Post, deeply tied to the establishment and heavily reliant on official sources, printed only the barest, most sanitized details of the vice raids. They dutifully ignored the rumors of aristocratic involvement and strictly adhered to the narrative that a few low-class criminals had been rightfully punished. They were complicit in the cover-up, choosing access to power over the duty to report the truth. But the late Victorian era was also the golden age of the radical press. There existed a network of independent, fiercely anti-establishment newspapers that catered to the working classes, publications that thrived on exposing the hypocrisy of the ruling elite. The most dangerous of these journalists was a man named Ernest Park, the editor of the fiercely independent North London Press. Park was a crusader, a man who despised the aristocratic privilege that allowed men like Somerset to operate above the law. He had been quietly investigating the Cleveland Street rumors, gathering whispers from disgruntled police officers and lower court clerks. He knew about the flight of Lord Arthur Somerset. He knew about the massive cover-up orchestrated by the Home Office, and he decided he was going to blow the entire conspiracy wide open. On a cold morning in November 1889, the North London press hit the streets with explosive headlines. Park did what the mainstream media lacked the courage to do. He named names. He publicly accused Lord Arthur Somerset of fleeing the country to escape prosecution for his involvement in the Cleveland Street brothel. He detailed the unprecedented delays in issuing the warrants and openly questioned the integrity of the Prime Minister and the police commissioner. The article was a bombshell. It tore through London, passing from hand to hand in the working-class pubs and the gentlemen's clubs alike. Park had single-handedly broken the establishment's embargo on the truth. However, Park made one crucial, devastating error in his crusading zeal. In his determination to expose the entire network of elite clients, he relied on an unverified tip from a secondary source and named another highly prominent aristocrat as a patron of the brothel, the Earl of Euston. This gave the government exactly the opening they needed. The establishment, reeling from the exposure of Somerset, could not afford to let Park's reporting stand as undisputed fact. They needed to destroy his credibility and bankrupt his newspaper, and the Earl of Euston became the instrument of their retaliation. Euston immediately filed a criminal libel suit against Ernest Park. The subsequent trial was not really about the Earl of Euston. It was a proxy war waged by the state to crush a journalist who had dared to speak the truth about Lord Arthur Somerset. The courtroom became an arena where the establishment flexed its immense power. Euston took the stand and admitted incredibly that he had indeed visited 19 Cleveland Street. However, he claimed under oath that he had been walking past, saw a card in the window, advertising poses plastiques, a form of erotic but legal female modeling, and went inside out of mere curiosity. He testified that as soon as he realized the true nature of the establishment, he was shocked and immediately left. It was an entirely preposterous defense, a transparent lie designed to save face, but the British legal system was prepared to swallow it whole to protect its own. The judge directed the jury with intense bias against the journalist. Park's defense attorney tried desperately to bring the focus back to the broader cover-up and the flight of Lord Arthur Somerset, but the court strictly limited the scope of the trial. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Ernest Park, the only man who had the courage to print the truth about the corruption at the heart of the British Empire, was found guilty of criminal libel. He was sentenced to a year in prison, a devastating punishment that broke his health and ruined his newspaper. The state had successfully utilized the courts to silence its most dangerous critic, reinforcing the iron wall of the cover-up. While Ernest Park sat in a cold prison cell for telling the truth, and the young telegraph boys endured hard labor for their desperation, Lord Arthur Somerset was sitting in a sunlit parlor in a French villa, reading about these events in the English newspapers delivered to his door. He had escaped the physical confines of a British prison, yet he had entered a different kind of imprisonment. He was a man entirely defined by his Englishness, his aristocratic standing, and his proximity to the royal family. Now he was a permanent exile, a ghost haunting the edges of Europe. He was wealthy enough to live in comfort, but he could never return to the estates he loved. He could never again wear his military uniform or stand beside the Prince of Wales. He was safe, but he was entirely alone, severed from the only world he knew how to navigate. This is the fragile beauty and the terrible tragedy of the human experience. The capacity to secure one's own physical survival while simultaneously destroying one's soul. The reality of exile is rarely a sudden, violent break. More often, it is a slow, suffocating realization that the world you once commanded has seamlessly closed ranks without you. Lord Arthur Somerset awoke to this reality in the sun-drenched, manicured environs of the French Riviera, a landscape of astonishing physical beauty that served only to highlight the stark emptiness of his new existence. He had successfully outmaneuvered Scotland Yard, he had blackmailed the Prime Minister, and he had preserved his liberty. But as the Mediterranean sun streamed into his parlor, the true cost of his survival became undeniably clear. He was no longer the superintendent of the royal stables. He was no longer the confidant of the future king. He was a ghost, a man who possessed immense wealth and absolute freedom, yet had nowhere to go and no one to be. For a Victorian aristocrat, identity was the empire. Somerset possessed no independent artistic passions or entrepreneurial drive. His worth was measured entirely by his proximity to the crown, the cut of his cavalry uniform, the respect he commanded in the elite gentlemen's clubs of St. James's, and the horses he meticulously managed for the royal household. When he crossed the English Channel in the dead of night, all of that was instantly incinerated. In London, the erasure was brutally efficient. His name was quietly struck from the registers of his clubs. His military rank was revoked. His father, the Duke of Beaufort, a man of immense pride and ancient lineage, was forced to bear the heavy, unspoken shame of a disgraced son. The family ensured Somerset was provided with a generous financial allowance, but this money came with a silent, ironclad condition. He was never to return, and he was never to speak of the past. It was a gilded cage, a luxurious quarantine designed to protect the establishment from the infection of his memory. Somerset spent his days drifting through the elegant resorts of Europe, from Dieppe to Florence to Hamburg. He rode rented horses, dined in fine restaurants, and socialized with the fringes of European aristocracy and other wealthy expatriates. Yet beneath the veneer of leisure there was a constant, gnawing isolation. He was a man forced to live entirely in the present because his past was a criminal offense and his future was completely stagnant. He read the English newspapers delivered to his door, tracking the events of a society that he still loved deeply, but which had aggressively expelled him. He read about the imprisonment of the telegraph boys and the ruin of his solicitor, Arthur Newton. He read about the journalist Ernest Park being sent to a cold cell for daring to publish the truth of his escape. Somerset had to live with the knowledge that his privilege had bought his freedom with the currency of other people's destruction. This is the fragile beauty and the terrible tragedy of the human experience. The capacity to secure one's own physical survival while simultaneously destroying one's soul. Meanwhile, back in the sprawling palaces of London, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of profound, lingering paranoia. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury and the Prince of Wales had successfully buried the Cleveland Street scandal, but the sheer effort required to orchestrate the cover-up had exposed the terrifying vulnerability of the monarchy. They had stared directly into the abyss. They recognized that the British public, increasingly literate and politically aware, would not tolerate a royal family that operated as a syndicate of moral corruption. The immediate threat of Lord Arthur Somerset had been neutralized, but the underlying liability remained sitting comfortably within the royal household, Prince Albert Victor. Prince Eddie, second in line to the throne, emerged from the scandal legally untouched but politically damaged. Within the closed, whispered circles of the elite, the rumors of his involvement at the Fitzrovia brothel clung to him like a dark stain. The establishment knew that they could not rely on another miraculous cover-up if Eddie's private life triggered another crisis. The future king was viewed not as a beacon of imperial stability, but as an unguided missile. The crown recognized that the only way to neutralize this threat was to forcefully rehabilitate his image, to anchor him to a foundation of undeniable traditional respectability. The solution, as it so often was for the Victorian elite, was a calculated, highly strategic marriage. Queen Victoria herself, possessing a sharp political instinct and a ruthless desire to preserve the dynasty, took charge of the operation. The royal family scoured Europe for a bride who possessed the strength of character, the moral fortitude, and the unyielding sense of duty necessary to keep Prince Eddie in line and repair his public standing. They found their answer in Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known to her family as May. She was serious, intelligent, deeply conservative, and entirely committed to the survival of the monarchy. The engagement was swiftly arranged and announced to the public with great fanfare in late 1891. The establishment breathed a collective sigh of relief. A royal wedding would dominate the newspapers, capturing the public's imagination and finally washing away the lingering toxic residue of the Cleveland Street rumors. The state was actively attempting to rewrite the narrative, replacing the image of the clandestine brothel with the glittering spectacle of a royal procession. But history rarely adheres to the neat, sanitized scripts written by politicians. In January 1892, just weeks before he was to be married, a massive influenza pandemic swept across the globe, reaching the freezing, windswept estates of Norfolk. Prince Albert Victor fell violently ill at Sandringham House. Despite the frantic efforts of the finest doctors in the empire, his condition deteriorated rapidly. On January 14, 1892, the man who had nearly brought down the British monarchy with his secret desires died in his bed at the age of 28. The public reaction was a massive outpouring of national grief. The streets of London were draped in black. The newspapers printed endless columns mourning the tragic, untimely loss of a young prince in the prime of his life. But behind the closed doors of Whitehall and Buckingham Palace, beneath the heavy veils of mourning, there was a different, deeply unsettling emotion, a profound, unspeakable relief. The government and the royal family would never admit it aloud, but Prince Eddie's sudden death was the ultimate, permanent solution to their greatest political nightmare. The liability had been removed by an act of nature, the threat of a future scandal, the terrifying leverage that men like Somerset had exploited. was buried along with him in the royal vault at Windsor. The contradiction was absolute. On one side stood Prince Albert Victor, receiving a magnificent state funeral, mourned by millions, immortalized in marble as a tragic hero of the realm, his deepest secrets forever protected by the full weight of the British state. On the other side, looking out over the Mediterranean, you have Lord Arthur Somerset, a man who shared the very same secrets, condemned by the world as a moral degenerate, permanently exiled and erased from history. One man is given glory, the other is given condemnation, not because their actions were fundamentally different, but because power dictates who is allowed to be human and who is required to be a scapegoat. The system demands a sacrifice to maintain its illusion of purity. The Cleveland Street scandal and its aftermath fundamentally reshaped the way the Victorian establishment dealt with its own hypocrisy. Rather than leading to a period of reflection or a softening of the brutal laws that criminalized human nature, the near miss terrified the government into adopting an even harsher, more rigid stance on public morality. They realized how close the radical press had come to destroying them, and they resolved never to let the mask slip again. The police were instructed to crack down on underground networks with renewed, ferocious energy. The society became increasingly paranoid, obsessed with rooting out moral decay, a trajectory that would culminate just a few years later in the devastating, highly public destruction of Oscar Wilde in 1895. The establishment had learned from Somerset that secrets were dangerous, and they decided that the safest course of action was to crush anyone who deviated from the norm before those secrets could be weaponized. As the 19th century drew to a close, the actors in this grand tragic theater began to fade into the margins of history. The telegraph boys, their lives permanently derailed by hard labor and public infamy, disappeared back into the grinding poverty from which they had tried to escape. Inspector Aberline, the honest policeman who tried to enforce the law equally, retired in frustration, having learned the bitter lesson that justice has a ceiling. And Lord Arthur Somerset continued his long, quiet march toward old age in the south of France. He outlived the prime minister who had saved him. He outlived the queen he had served. He outlived the prince he had blackmailed. But as he sat in his opulent exile, completely safe from the law, but entirely severed from his life, he must have asked himself the ultimate question. When you use your own ruin to conquer the most powerful empire on earth, did you really win the war, or did you simply negotiate the terms of your own execution? The British establishment did not merely survive the Cleveland Street scandal. They institutionalized the methods used to suppress it. The ad hoc panic that had gripped the government in the summer of 1889 was systematically replaced by a cold, highly organized approach to elite surveillance and crisis management. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, having narrowly averted a constitutional disaster, recognized that the machinery of state protection required permanent reinforcement. The government learned a brutal but highly effective lesson. The most efficient way to prevent a scandal was not to enforce moral laws equally, but to control the flow of information with absolute ruthless prejudice. The state shifted its focus from eradicating vice to eradicating exposure. This era marked a silent, fundamental alteration within the ranks of the Metropolitan Police. Scotland Yard previously focused on street-level crime and the immediate threats of Irish Republican terrorism, was forced to turn a quiet, watchful eye inward. The independence of the investigative branches was severely curtailed. Men like Inspector Frederick Aberline, who possessed the dangerous combination of working-class pragmatism and an unyielding commitment to the law, found their careers quietly suffocated. They were systematically sidelined, replaced by career bureaucrats and politically malleable officers who understood that their primary duty was to the preservation of the social order rather than the blind execution of justice. The police force was effectively weaponized to serve the class system. When dealing with the impoverished, the law was applied with crushing theatrical brutality to assure the middle classes that order was being maintained. When dealing with the aristocracy, the law became a highly flexible, negotiable concept, a gentleman's agreement written in disappearing ink. This institutional hypocrisy was physically manifested in the changing landscape of London itself. The house at 19 Cleveland Street, once the epicenter of the greatest threat to the Victorian monarchy, was eventually demolished. Its bricks and mortar were erased from the city map just as efficiently as Lord Arthur Somerset's name was erased from the army list. The physical evidence of the establishment's extreme vulnerability was scrubbed clean, replaced by newly paved roads and respectable anonymous facades. The government attempted to pave over the truth, burying the geography of their corruption under layers of urban renewal. However, the psychological architecture of the cover-up remained deeply embedded in the public consciousness. The British working classes, though denied the full unvarnished truth by a compliant mainstream press, were not blind. A deep, lingering, and toxic cynicism took root among the people who actually built and sustained the empire. They watched the devastating double standard play out in real time. They saw men who stole a loaf of bread to feed their families, transported to penal colonies, or locked in freezing cells, while lords who broke the most stringent, heavily penalized moral laws of the era were merely sent on extended, fully funded European vacations. The unwritten social contract of the Victorian era, the foundational promise that the ruling class possessed the moral right to govern by virtue of their superior character, was permanently, irreparably fractured. The young men who came of age in the long shadow of the Cleveland Street scandal grew up in a society fundamentally built on a lie. They were taught to revere a monarchy and an aristocracy that had actively conspired to subvert the rule of law to protect their own desires. When Lord Arthur Somerset finally died at the age of 74, the event was met with deafening silence from the country he had once served. There was no grand state funeral. There were no black-bordered columns of mourning in the Times. The death of the former royal equerry was noted with the barest minimum of necessary legal paperwork. A brief, sterile acknowledgement by his family's lawyers that a minor financial obligation of the Beaufort estate had finally been concluded. He was buried quietly in a foreign cemetery, his gravestone marking the final resting place of a man who had once stood at the absolute center of British imperial power. The state had achieved its ultimate victory. They had not only silenced him and forced him from their shores, they had weaponized time and isolation to render his entire existence completely irrelevant. But history possesses a relentless mechanism for exhuming the truths that power attempts to bury in unmarked graves. The Cleveland Street scandal did not disappear into the classified archives, as Lord Salisbury and the Crown had desperately hoped. It survived in the margins of the official record. It lived on in the private diaries of radical politicians, in the bitter unpublished memoirs of sideline police officers like Aberline, and crucially, in the institutional memory of a working class that never forgot the sight of their sons being dragged away in chains while a lord walked free to the south of France. The scandal eventually became a master key for historians attempting to unlock the true nature of the Victorian establishment. It ruthlessly stripped away the grand, romanticized narratives of imperial glory, unyielding duty, and moral progress. What was left exposed was the cold transactional reality beneath the velvet and the metals, a political and legal system where justice was nothing more than a luxury commodity, available only to those who could afford the exorbitant purchase price, or to those who wielded the catastrophic threat of mutual destruction. The death of Lord Arthur Somerset in the quiet exile of the French Riviera might seem like the natural conclusion to this narrative, the final period placed at the end of a long, heavily redacted sentence. The Victorian establishment certainly believed it was. They had successfully navigated the immediate crisis, silenced the radical press, imprisoned the working-class witnesses, and waited out the natural lifespan of the man who held the detonator. They operated under the arrogant assumption that because they controlled the levers of state power, they could permanently control the verdict of history. They believed that memory, like the justice system itself, could be bought, managed, and eventually erased. But history is rarely that compliant. The truth of the Cleveland Street scandal did not die with Somerset, nor was it successfully buried in the vaults of Windsor Castle, because the architects of the cover-up underestimated the stubborn, fragile resilience of paper and human trauma. The survival of the truth is rooted in the immense, almost desperate efforts the British Crown undertook to sanitize its own archives. In the years following the scandal, and particularly after the untimely death of Prince Albert Victor, a quiet but ruthless purge of royal correspondence took place. Letters, diary entries, and official memos detailing the frantic negotiations between Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, the Home Office, and the royal household were systematically gathered and fed to the fires. The monarchy was acutely aware that the future would judge them not by their public proclamations, but by their private panic. They sought to leave behind a perfectly curated historical record, a smooth, unblemished marble facade that presented an unbroken line of royal dignity. They destroyed the evidence of their own corruption to protect the myth of their inherent superiority. Yet, bureaucracies are inherently flawed machines, and complete erasure is an impossible task. While the royal household was burning its personal letters, the sprawling machinery of the British government inadvertently preserved the crime. Deep within the dusty, forgotten filing cabinets of the Home Office and the Director of Public Prosecutions, routine administrative documents survived. Internal police memos detailing the obstruction of warrants, the furious scribbled complaints of Commissioner James Monroe, and the precise, heavily censored transcripts of the initial interrogations were filed away and simply forgotten. These documents were not seen as explosive at the time. They were just the mundane paperwork of a successfully executed cover-up. But decades later, When the Official Secrets Act expired and these files were finally opened to historians, they formed a devastating, undeniable paper trail. The state had successfully hidden the body, but they had carefully filed away the receipts. The survival of this bureaucratic evidence stands in brutal contrast to the physical and emotional devastation inflicted upon the working-class boys at the center of the storm. While the state carefully managed its paper trail, it actively destroyed human lives. The telegraph messengers, boys like Luke Kemp and Henry Newlove, were temporarily blasted across court records before fading into absolute obscurity. Their human experience is the dark, heavy anchor of this narrative. When the telegraph messengers were finally released from the brutal conditions of hard labor, they emerged as outcasts permanently branded by a stigma society deemed unspeakable. Stripped of opportunity and burdened with criminal records, their lives effectively ended before they had truly begun. The families of boys like Luke Kemp and Henry Newlove carried this trauma silently across generations, a quiet legacy of shame standing as the true human cost of the cover-up. This deep injustice also broke the men who were initially sworn to prevent it. Consider the fate of Inspector Frederick Aberline, the relentless detective who had built the airtight case against Somerset. Aberline was a man who genuinely believed in the blind application of the law, a foundational belief that gave his difficult, often gruesome work meaning. Watching the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary actively conspire to dismantle his investigation and facilitate the escape of a wanted criminal fundamentally shattered his faith in the institution he served. He realized with profound clarity that he was not a guardian of justice, but merely a janitor for the elite, employed to sweep up the messes they left in the lower-class districts, while being strictly forbidden from knocking on the doors of Mayfair. Aberline quietly retired from the Metropolitan Police just a few years after the scandal. He retreated from the public eye, carrying with him the bitter, corrosive knowledge of how the empire truly operated behind its gilded doors. His retirement was a silent protest, the resignation of a public servant who could no longer stomach the hypocrisy of his masters. The personal suffering of a man like Aberline is less visible than the hard labor of the telegraph boys, but it is no less profound. It is the deep internal rot that occurs when a person realizes that their life's work has been manipulated to serve the very corruption they were sworn to fight. The Cleveland Street scandal did not just pervert the course of justice, it actively destroyed the moral compass of the men tasked with enforcing it. The ripple effects of this orchestrated silence forever altered the landscape of British society. The aristocracy, terrified by how close they had come to the precipice, did not abandon their hidden lives. They simply became infinitely more paranoid and highly organized. The scandal served as a brutal warning that the establishment would not hesitate to consume its own to protect the crown. In response, the underground networks of elite London became more tightly coded, operating with a level of extreme, desperate secrecy that defined homosexual life in Britain for the next century. The state had inadvertently created a culture of deep fear and sophisticated evasion. By choosing to suppress the truth rather than confront the reality of human nature, the Victorian government ensured that the collision between private desire and public law would remain a bloody, destructive battleground for generations to come. The aftermath of the Cleveland Street scandal did not merely reshape the lives of those directly involved. It cast a long, suffocating shadow over the entire social landscape of Britain, effectively setting the stage for the tragedies of the incoming century. The government had drawn a line in the sand. They had demonstrated with brutal clarity that the machinery of the state would not tolerate any further threats to the moral facade of the ruling class. The immediate response was a cultural lockdown. The late 1890s became an era of intense moral panic, fueled by the terrifying unspoken knowledge that the rot had reached the very steps of the throne. This paranoid atmosphere created a society entirely at war with human nature. The police, having been humiliated by their inability to prosecute Lord Arthur Somerset, turned their frustrations upon the less protected members of the hidden world. The working classes and eventually the vulnerable members of the artistic and literary elite became the primary targets of a justice system desperate to prove its own uncompromising virtue. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The very same legal establishment that had actively conspired to put the master of the horse on a train to France would, just a few years later, deploy the full devastating weight of the law to destroy men who lacked the aristocratic leverage to save themselves. The system did not become more moral, it simply became more efficient at crushing those who could not fight back. Lord Arthur Somerset understood the fundamental emptiness of his society's values. He knew the grand uniforms and ancient titles were ultimately theater, a magnificent distraction from the cold, transactional reality of power. When the curtain threatened to fall, he did not hesitate to burn down the theater to save himself. Yet, his survival was indistinguishable from his destruction. He traded a physical prison for a psychological one, living 4 decades as an exiled ghost on the French Riviera. He watched from afar as his country marched into the modern age, fighting wars he could not join and celebrating coronations he could not attend. He had successfully held the crown hostage, only to discover that the crown was perfectly content to let him rot in luxurious obscurity. The Cleveland Street scandal stands as a permanent monument to institutional hypocrisy. Its true legacy is not found in the private desires of a disgraced aristocrat, but in the organized silence of a state apparatus that willingly broke its own justice system to protect the crown. The scandal forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of authority. If the law is not applied equally to the highest ranks of society, does it possess any true moral authority at all, or is it merely a weapon used by the powerful to control the powerless? Lord Arthur Somerset withdrew into the silence of history, his name carefully scrubbed from the official records, his story reduced to whispers and sealed files. But the mechanism he exposed, the brutal truth that a shared explosive secret can paralyze a government, was a lesson that other ambitious, desperate men of the era were watching closely. The British establishment believed they had successfully plugged the leak in the dam, but the pressure of human nature and aristocratic arrogance was still building beneath the surface. There was another figure navigating the gilded corridors of late Victorian London, a nobleman who possessed an even darker secret and a far more reckless disposition. He watched the Cleveland Street cover-up unfold, and he learned exactly how much leverage a disgraced aristocrat could exert over a terrified monarchy. When his own private life collided with the unforgiving laws of the empire, he did not flee to France. He chose to stand his ground, weaponizing his secrets not just to secure his own freedom, but to launch an unprecedented frontal assault on the entire moral fabric of the British government. His actions would trigger a scandal that made Cleveland Street look like a minor misunderstanding, threatening to expose a network of corruption that stretched far beyond a single brothel in Fitzrovia.